Japanese air power wasn't all about the Zero, and in this episode of our 4-part series on Japanese aviation, we will talk about how Japan developed bomber tactics. What lessons did they draw from operations in China? What did they do well? What critical mistakes did they make? Join returning guest Justin Pike and me as we discuss this and more in today's episode. For the interested, Part 1 on Japanese fighter tactics and Part 3 to 4 are linked in the description, along with our sources. All remaining episodes are available early for Patreons and channel members. You can sign up for these and join our community via the links in the description. A big thank you go to Vinko, Steven and Randy for already signing up. Right, Japanese bomber tactics and formations. Now this is going to be very different to most likely the Japanese fighters. But if we sort of look at China and then the operations in the late 1930s there, and then the start, of course, of World War II for Japan and also the US, we tend to think of the Pacific and the South Pacific for World War II with Japanese fight tactics mainly, because the Zero is sort of that archetype adversary there. But a lot of the Japanese tactics when it comes to bombers must have already developed, just like we had on the fighter episode, in China, where they were waiting for about 4 years before Pearl Harbor. Could you give sort of a picture overview of the operations there?
Yeah, so Japanese bombing raids at the outset of the war were, in summary, really small and mostly ineffective. So it was reflecting a lack of experience or training in attacking land targets, particularly on the part of the Japanese Navy Air Service. When you look at their early operations, there are multiple raids they're conducting against Chinese airfields in 37 that are occurring at exceptionally low level, like 350 to 450 meters. That's like, like 1,100 to 1,400 feet-ish. The attacks appeared so absurd that one American intelligence report that had observed some of these concluded that Japanese, quote, horizontal bombing at ridiculously low altitudes was not in the nature of aerial warfare at all, was rather the aerial transport of high explosives, end quote. So the losses in these early unescorted low-level attacks were high. The Japanese Navy's first combined air group lost half of its land-based attack aircraft, so its twin-engine bombers, in 3 days of operations, leading to the group's detailed after-action report to compare the bomber losses to the extremely bloody Battle of 203 Meter Hill during the Russo-Japanese War.
And how many aircraft are we talking about here, if it's half of them?
So typically the early raids, they consisted of maybe 9 to at most 18 aircraft, so 1 or 2 Chutai. The small scale of these raids were due in part to a belief that small numbers of bombers could be decisive, which, as you've noted, I mean, it technically could be. Like if you could hit your target, sure, but of course hitting your targets is not a simple thing. And as a byproduct of this assumption, the Japanese Navy bomber crews, they were not trained to fly in large formations, and they had difficulty holding such formations in combat. This was made worse as losses mounted, and then different formations were kind of smashed together from the survivors, and then there was a predictable loss of unit cohesion. And American observers would consistently note that Japanese bombers, they tended to break formation and bomb individually. So Clairley Chenault, who was an American advisor to the Chinese at the time, he observed Japanese bombing raids against Nanjing in 1937, and he stated that, quote, Japanese bombers use very poor tactics, come over in small units, ragged formation, end quote. Another intelligence report from January 1938 on Japanese bombing in southern China, it emphasized that, quote, formations are usually scattered. Upon arrival over objective, the formation, such as it is, breaks up completely, and bombing is done individually, and the individually is actually underlined. There has been no pattern bombing, end quote. And to add to that, when they're observing is, when they're talking about no pattern bombing or bombing being done individually, it's not even just that the aircraft break up and then just drop their bombs somewhere and leave. You would see at times, quite commonly, one bomber would go over their target, drop one bomb, circle back around, come back, drop their second bomb, come back around.
Wow. Okay.
And of course, you can do that when there are no fighters around. There's barely any fighter opposition. But of course, that is just not going to. Yeah, it's not going to work against opponents that have significant air opposition, which they'd already run into in China too, in other areas. But of course, this is showing like a lack of experience on the part of the Japanese bomber crews, and the sophistication of a lack of sophistication in Japanese bomber tactics in this early stage of the war in like 37, early 38.
I mean, the interesting bit is here, of course, that initially this is something that basically every country learns, is that when you use bombers, you bomb en masse. You have one lead bomber there. You maybe have one bomber that takes over if the lead bomber gets shot down or falls behind due to damage. And then you drop en masse as the leader drops its bombs, right? This is something that the Germans learned. This is something that the British learned. Who also did a lot of like individual bombing, especially at night, but that's another story. And of course, that's also something that the US had to learn. But this idea that you could drop one single bomb at a time, is this just to improve accuracy? Is this did this even have an effect on the ground? Because I can assume that if there's no opposition of any kind, neither fighter interceptors or ground defenses, that this could theoretically be quite effective. But is there any sort of report on this?
Yeah, like as far as the effects of some of this early bombing, a lot of it is not particularly effective because they just don't have you were talking about interwar twin engine bombers, right? Like they're carrying upwards of, for the Japanese, like at most 800 kilograms worth of bombs, usually mostly 60-kilogram bombs for the Navy if they're carrying multiple, or 50-kilogram bombs if they're Army. As far as this individual bombing goes, like at least as far as the American observer, the Western observers that I've read are concerned, they're not really impressed by it really at all. I've seen a handful of reports that, but they're usually from later on, where they're talking about, for example, they're quite impressed with the performance of the 60-kilogram bombs of all things, at least as far as hitting light targets. But as far as this early accuracy and things like, there's a lot of contempt for, and this is where things get a little particular, because remember that these American observers are stewing in their own thoughts on how bombers are supposed to work in the late 1930s, and quite frankly, they haven't done it themselves yet. So some of their criticism is perhaps just, it's stemming from their own over-optimistic assumptions. I'm like, well, if you give us 5 bombers, we'll go in and we'll put it down, so as long as you filter that out.
Well, we've seen them try this. We see them try this in the early Pacific as well, and not really, and really coming to the same conclusion that small pockets of bombers aren't really that effective at all.
Yeah. So setting that stuff aside, for the most part, like these early Japanese operations are clearly struggling, and you can see that just because they're not proving absolutely devastating to the Chinese. They're not knocking out large Chinese factories. They're not devastating all Chinese airfields that they hit. They're struggling clearly, and this also reflects in the Japanese response to these early operations as well.
So I do wonder here at this point, as though, is this inexperience? Is this unfamiliarity with land-based targets? Whereas if they hit, or if they do their practice runs against maritime targets, they're actually doing better, or much of this is just transposed from the maritime tactics over to land targets? Or is this just a blatant sort of the typical 1930s, the bomber will always come through sort of mentality that never mind what you do, a couple of bombs will fix the problem?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, really. Particularly when you talk about the Navy, because the vast majority of their training pre-China is focused on maritime issues, maritime patrol, attacking accurately against maneuvering ship targets, torpedo warfare. Are starting to enter the picture for the land-based units. Like the G3M is still very new, and that's like one of basically the first bomber that they have on the land-based units that can do it. So that was their focus going into this war. So one example I can think of is like weapon target pairings are a little weird sometimes when it comes to the Navy, because they obviously had a preference going in doctrinally for like, we're going to carry a very small number of larger bombs, which against shipping targets, of course, is what you need to do. But it takes them a little while to start figuring out that maybe we need to actually pepper an area with a variety of different smaller bombs. They start mixing bomb loads. So you can see images of G3Ms in China that are flying out with maybe one 250-kilogram bomb and then some 60-kilogram bombs on top of that. So there's lots of like little adaptations like that of this air service trying to feel out, hey, how do we, in the words of the late great historian Mark Peaty, how do we attack a continent instead of ships?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I mean, with Japan, or especially the Navy having a very sort of maritime Pacific outlook, attacking land targets is drastically different, and that is also something that not just Japan, or not just in the Japanese Navy, discovered. But as we look sort of at this adaptation, so okay, they're figuring out a little bit of what is the bomb load, what is the concentration of bombs they want to put in any sort of square mile and postcode. What are some other changes that they're doing? So you said that they're attacking from very low altitudes. Again, this is something that a lot of countries did at the start of the war. But then very rapidly they increase the altitudes, and that also causes then a drop in accuracy most of the time. Is that the same thing? Is that the same thing happening with the Japanese Navy?
Yeah, exactly the same pattern. So you start to see that bombing raids, they begin to occur from typically between 3,000 meters, that's almost 10,000 feet. And then there could, even in cases where they were anticipating heavy opposition, altitudes could exceed 7,000 meters, that's like 23,000 feet, with use of oxygen. Which was something that they had to, of course, feel out as well, just to keep bomber losses reasonable. But of course, when you're bombing from that high up, it means that there's a drop in accuracy as well. Formation discipline also improved it like almost immeasurably. So the formation tactics evolved both for defense against fighters and for pattern bombing. So when defending against fighters, Japanese Navy bomber formations, they would collapse from kind of a V of V's into a very tight, like pseudo line abreast to maximize defensive firepower. Now, of course, you can get into all sorts of discussions that, well, there's, the American combat box and everything like that. So I'm not necessarily going to say definitively, oh, this was the way to do it or anything, but it shows that like they are improving they're proving their defensive formations compared to the formation barely exists and then it breaks up over the target.
Well, the combat box also had to operate in a completely different environment than 1930s China, where fighter planes are probably not necessarily being vectored by radar, not coming from different directions, and also the performance of those fighters vis-a-vis the bombers are very different. And also the angles, the firing angles from the bombers are also going to be different. So they probably figured out a relatively good way of defending their bombers by trial and error.
Yeah. And then in 1940-41, I don't have an exact date here. There was a new system of formation bombing introduced. So all bombers in a formation dropped their bombs simultaneously when instructed by a lead bombardier. These lead bombardiers, they were selected based on skill rather than seniority, and then they were put through an extensive training program. Of course, this is very similar to what other air forces adopted, including the U.S. Army Air Force later on. Now, the number of bombers involved in individual raids also increased dramatically. After a major Japanese Army bomber operation that had occurred in kind of late 38, early 39, the Japanese found that if they only had like a handful of aircraft in their heavy bomber regiments that they were using in an attack, that it really gave the enemy a lot of chance to attack them, because in the air they were just losing communication and cooperation was very often lost. And one of the results of this is that we need to dramatically increase the size of our raids. In 1939, the number of Japanese Navy Air Service bombers conducting raids in the Chinese interior was between 18 and 36. So you're seeing like a little bit of increase from 37. By summer of 1940, the figures increased to between 50 and 90 per raid.
Okay.
Wow. And there could be raids that were potentially even larger than that. And this was also reflected in Japanese Navy Air Service organizations. So the air groups would give away to combined air groups, and then they start to envision air fleets to carry out these large scale operations. And then, by the onset of the spring of 1940, the first of two major joint Japanese Navy and Army strategic bombing efforts, like the scale and level of coordination for those raids bore no resemblance to what had come before. Like these were fundamentally just different air organizations, perhaps unsurprisingly for people that are familiar with the evolution of the CBO in Europe. And this could be noted as well by reading what foreign observers were seeing. So it's not even like something that we only know in hindsight. This was so readily apparent that even at the time, people on the ground, like Americans, Brits, whoever, observing these operations, were noticing that, again, like in a 1940 intelligence report, Chinese aviators that they were talking to, they described Japanese Navy bomber formation discipline as excellent. Their level bombing is good and continuously improving. And they also just kept noting the consistent use of large formations. Another American report, this time from 41, they noted that, quote, Japanese tactics have been modified considerably since 1937, end quote. And then they went on to detail, again, the increased size and discipline of bombing formations, the use of reconnaissance aircraft to check weather and assess targets, bombing from higher altitudes. And two other features of note we'll discuss perhaps in a future video is the widespread use of fighter escort for the bombers and fighter sweeps preceding the raids. Now, one kind of interesting irony of all of this is that while they were improving in their ability to attack land targets, specifically for the Japanese Navy land-based bombers, they weren't practicing their maritime duties. So what ended up happening is they actually had to be pulled up in the autumn of 1941. They were pulled out of China so that they could start working up for the move south. They had to basically retrain on attacking maritime targets, doing maritime patrol, navigation over water, all those things that they would need to start doing their original role again of closely cooperating with the surface fleet. Now, given the performance of their maritime duties throughout the early offensives, this pre-war workup was successful, but it necessitated the withdrawal of the Japanese Navy Air Service from China to do it for a few months before the war. Now, the experience in China of attacking land targets, particularly airfields, that did become very useful in the outset of the Asia-Pacific War.
I mean, I do have a question there. I mean, if the Navy has to pull out of China in order to sort of recoup and refamiliarize themselves with their primary skill set that they required and for their upcoming plans in the Pacific and the South Pacific, starting in late 1941, I don't want to stir sort of this competition between the Army and the Navy here that Japan was famous for, but where was the Army in this case? Like, were they also conducting similar things that you were sort of talking about? Was this a similar development within the Army, or was this just Navy? And
the Army was developing along similar lines. Now, there's certain caveats here in that I am limited by our source base because, unfortunately, when it comes to the Japanese Army Air Service, there is very little writing in English on the Japanese Army Air Service that is actually studying it in any detail as an institution, particularly before the war. There's like a little bit you can find during the war itself, but from what I could observe through looking at through the Japanese monographs, American intelligence reports, all that, they're learning similar lessons. They're coming to grips with similar things. Their use of air power, of course, is quite different from the Navy because they don't have the maritime duties. Their primary theater in their minds is in Manchuria, facing the Soviets. That influences their aircraft design. That influences how they are envisioning what they'll do with their air power. And the China war, for the most part, just kind of feeds into what they were already incrementally improving on because they're already operating over land, hitting land targets, trying to knock out enemy aviation, interdiction, close air support, those kinds of things. So there's definitely improvement development on the Army side as well. Their main issue once they start getting dragged into specifically the South Pacific Air War is that you're telling all these Army boys who were trained to fly over the steppes to start doing long range missions entirely over open ocean. And really there's a really rough transition period that I don't think the Japanese Army Air Service, certainly in through the mid part of the war, ever really fully comes to grips with. They're really struggling to make their air power work in the South Pacific because it was just not what they planned to do.
I mean, if we look sort of at the outlook, going back to the Navy here, we have the Navy, that's a maritime strike force that involves automatically discussions about range and delivering that firepower at range. And then they're operating on the continent or like in China, and that's very different, of course, as you already said. But how did this sort of expectation and also the designs that the aircraft had with range and the operational realities then coalesce in the Pacific? And how did that work out?
Yeah, so what I would argue is that their early experience in China, one of the biggest wins that they got out of it was learning how to conduct operations at extreme ranges, because that was a capability that the Japanese Navy and Army Air Services would have to use pretty much constantly from all the way until the surrender. So, in the words of the historian Osamu Tagaya, um, quote, in matters of distance, the air war in Asia was a different order of magnitude from the one in Europe, end quote. And it's really no exaggeration. The ranges that the Japanese have to conduct this air war at are astonishing. Even in the earliest days of the war in China, G3Ms, so Navy bombers, they made unprecedented round trips of up to 1,850 kilometers. So that's like over 1,100 miles, most of it over the East China Sea to launch strikes against Hangzhou, Shanghai, and Nanjing from their bases on Taiwan and Kyushu. These have often been described as the first transoceanic bombing campaign in history, which I guess would depend on how you define things like the Taiwan Strait and East China Sea. And then there was also, they were the Germans were bombing people over the Channel and stuff in the First World War even. But it's still an impressive feat nonetheless. To put things in kind of relative scale with Europe, I mean, the Japanese Navy was conducting air operations at distance that were longer than that from London to Berlin by 1941, like clockwork. On occasion in 1941, for example, there was a flight of A6Ms that flew information nonstop entirely at night, further than the average distance from British airfields to Hamburg to conduct a fighter sweep against Chengdu in the early morning. And they did it they had one G4M, so a bomber that tagged along with them for navigation reasons. And they conducted this ridiculously long-range fighter sweep, no problems, no losses. The ability to conduct such operations out to these extreme ranges was an outstanding achievement in the late 1930s and into 41, and I think it's understated by most historians. To really stress this point, the war in China gave the Japanese Air Services lots of real-world experience in dealing with the challenges that come with conducting long-range operations. So people who know a lot about the combined bomber offensive in Europe are probably familiar with many of them. How do you group up these large formations of bombers and then fly in formation for hours, navigating to the targets that are hundreds of kilometers away, coordinating with the fighter escort throughout all of this, coordinating with fighter sweeps and reconnaissance and weather reports. It's not a simple set of problems to solve, and the Japanese had to come to grips with them like other air forces would in their own longer range campaigns later on.
And how did they apply then this the China experience to World War II?
Yeah, so they used it right from the outset of the war. I mean, the Japanese, particularly the Navy, took the valuable experience and applied it right into that conflict. The speed and scope of the initial offensives was only made possible by the ability of Japanese air power to hit out hard to long ranges. And I will emphasize this is not just on a technical level of, they designed planes that can go that far. It's Japanese air power as an offensive system being able to reach out to extreme range and reduce Allied air power, hit their ships, interdict, do all of these mission roles out to these ranges that were very impressive. And while I'd argue that, that all of this is quite striking and impressive, at times it could serve as a crutch, I think. And you start to see this later on after the initial momentum of the early offensives has kind of worn off, is that they start to go, well, just because we can launch these missions at extreme range, it kind of means that we're just going to start doing it constantly. And I mean, the most extreme example of that is, of course, once the Americans land on Guadalcanal in 42, the Japanese Navy is forced to sustain these major air operations involving bombing raids and anti-shipping attacks and fighter sweeps against Guadalcanal and the surrounding area from its airfields around Rabaul in New Britain. And that distance involved, it's over 1,000 kilometers. It's like almost 650 miles one way. So again, for comparison, Berlin's roughly 740 kilometers, 460 miles from air bases in eastern Britain, roughly. It's an astonishing achievement, but also that's a really long way to try and sustain an air campaign.
I mean, that's what I was just going to say, because you can see it as an achievement, and you can really say, okay, so this is something that the Japanese do very, very well, and operating at range, of course, for air power is extremely important, and doing it well is even better. But aren't there sort of problems associated with this sort of operation at range? And do you create, especially now thinking about the South Pacific and the whole basic problem, do you not create sort of a dependency on range that if you were to have a little bit less range in your aircraft, maybe you would think about more about how do you base the aircraft, where would you build your airfields, and do you actually need to put a little bit more emphasis on that?
Yeah, exactly. Is that they decided to fight this extended campaign at these extreme ranges, and these ranges were so astonishing that when they initially they had pulled out the maps at Rabaul once there was landings on Guadalcanal, and they're showing the Zero pilots like, hey, we're going to send you here and fight this campaign. Even the Zero pilots were like, excuse me. And of course, like, it's the similar problems that you'll see for any Air Force that are operating out at like the very limits of what they can sustain as far as range goes. So they were forced to fight with their drop tanks attached rather than jettisoning them, because they needed to suck every last drop of fuel out of them to try keep themselves in the air. Even without dropping them, they had roughly a 15-minute fight time over Guadalcanal before their fuel situation forced them to return back to Rabaul. The A6M3, so a newer, improved version of the Zero that started to enter service around this time, it couldn't even reach Guadalcanal from Rabaul, which limited the number of fighters that could make the trip. And then those fighters themselves were older models until closer airfields were established. The strike missions, they lasted 8 hours or more, which of course was physically and mentally exhausting for the air crews involved. And the extreme range also made Japanese strikes predictable. Which was an issue with some long-range missions in China as well. But I mean, if you want to fly an 8-hour plus long mission and you don't want to risk returning after dark, you have very limited options. You know, you get ready to depart at daybreak, you fly the mission, you get back before dark. The Americans are going to know, and they did, roughly when strikes were going to show up. And of course, that was helped by their early warning, but they would always know within about an hour or two when they could expect attacks. And then, of course, if you sustain battle damage, you have to worry now about nursing your damaged plane or your injured self back like over 1,000 kilometers, a bit closer if you happen to limp to the underdeveloped grass strip at Buka. And then, of course, later on in the campaign, they would establish a much better airfield at Buin. But for a lot of this campaign, like, you're kind of just left out there, and there's a lot of Japanese aircrew who just end up dying because they can't make it back to a safe area to land. It's in large part this mission was forced on the Japanese Navy Air Service by itself. Because they had neglected airfield construction and defense before the war. And it took them a long time to build up forward airfields for the most part. Ironically, Henderson Field actually developed pretty quickly because they were quite lavishly equipped by Japanese standards as far as construction equipment went, and then the Americans grabbed it from them right when it was done. But just generally outside of that, like, it took them a while to do it. And the accommodating conditions of the air war in China had done little to encourage improvement in this area, nor had the opening campaigns, because for the most part, they could grab developed Allied airfields in their initial attacks and just use those and then leapfrog to the next one. And as soon as that was no longer an option, and they needed to start developing their own bases, they did so quite slowly. One astonishing thing that I read about is for the Japanese Navy, their construction units that they were using to build all these airfields and everything, I'd always just assumed that they'd been around for years and years before the war. They were established as they existed during the operational planning for the move south. Like, it was combined fleet going, hey, we're going to be capturing all this territory, and we need to establish construction units that can build airfields. They hadn't envisioned it. And the basic reason for that is that Yamamoto was thinking so far outside the box that the Japanese Navy hadn't designed itself to fight the kind of war that he was forcing upon it, operationally speaking. It was far more aggressive and expansive than what pre-war Japanese Navy thinking for 2 decades had envisioned. Because normally they'd be like, well, we'd be defending our own colonies and everything. We would just build up our airfields there on friendly ground and work off that, and then the Americans would come to us and we'd deal with them. But when you're stretching out all the way across the Pacific and you're constantly on the attack, you need to be able to build up air bases yourself quickly on the front line, which is something that the Japanese really, they just didn't have the resources to do properly.
I mean, this opens up a whole new sort of idea that we could maybe talk about in the future, sort of the systemic problems that they have. Because from what I gather in this video, again, it's similar to the fighter episode that we have, that is probably already out now for viewers to watch as well, is that tactically the Japanese are able to sort of compete with the Allies for a considerable amount of time, but there's sort of these underlying operational and then sort of strategic issues that they have that are being hidden behind sort of this tactical ability to still wrestle with the adversary for some time. So definitely something for us to look into in the future. And if you have any questions on that, please put them in the comments below. Big thank you here, of course, to all the viewers and the patrons and channel members who make this possible. And also to Justin, of course, because you're actually the man who's bringing all this knowledge and who's done the research behind all of this. So please also put your appreciation to Justin's here in the comments. And as always, I wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky. We hope that you enjoyed this episode, and if you want to get a hold of all remaining episodes early, support us via Patreon or channel memberships. You can sign up for these and join our community via the links in the description.